The Gospel of Zilch by the nonprofit Tim Snavely. Chapter 2. The Evolution of the Universe. Everything can be derived from nothing. For every something that can be asserted to be the first cause of everything, the null hypothesis has yet to be rejected for every something presented thus far. This doesn't mean that we should automatically accept the null hypothesis. On the contrary, most rational beings would dismiss this ex nihilo without further thought, since, in fact, nothing comes from nothing, and something comes from something else. However, I must rebut even this obvious notion as a logician, because it boldly and unwittingly assumes that we nulls are entities of something. Math. There is a mathematical basis from which we can equate everything finite to nothing when nothing is divided amongst itself, as artistically expressed in the previous chapter. Anything and everything quantitative and finite, which I symbolize as two infinity symbols making an X as shown here, can be multiplied by 0 and leave us with 0. And that's what everything looks like. Like that. Everything times 0 equals 0. Remember that everything is both finite and a range, not a determinate number. The point here is that we can put any determinate number in place of the symbol and it will be true in the equation, which is why I named the symbol everything. And we can also put everything in the denominator of the following equation using the division property of equivalence. 0 equals 0 divided by everything. Therefore, if we accept the premises of the previous equations, we should likewise accept the following equation as well, if we also temporarily disregard the rule of you can't divide by 0. Everything equals 0 divided by 0. Usually, when we divide things, we are dividing something. 1 divided by 1, 1 divided by 2, etc. But when we start with nothing, both the numerator and the denominator are empty. They both hold a grand total of 0 things. Now, thanks to this equation, I can tell you of this special and secret insight into the one true and ultimate origin of the multiverse. You, as a finite entity, can designate yourself as a finite number, just like the Lords of Nothingness. Give yourself any known number of somethingness, and you would be an acceptable and inevitable answer to the equation designated at the beginning of the set of everything. You are not highly improbable. You are inevitable. This exalted equation also tells us another, less interesting, special and secret insight into your nature. You are nothing. Unfortunately, that is in fact the secret. There is everything on one side of the equation and nothing on the other side. Everything is nothing. We are all null. So what holds the multiverse together? Nothing. Zilch are doing an amazing job, aren't they? Where exactly are these other universes that are parallel to ours? The same place where we are. Nowhere. There is a whole multiverse of non-verses being calculated simultaneously, thanks to Zilch the true first cause. And now that Zilch have been reasonably deduced to be a viable true first cause of the multiverse over 13 billion years ago, what has happened after that was a verifiable succession of physical causes that ultimately led to our current existence. Nothing made the first things in a hot, dense state, and then the hot, dense state cooled along with increasing entropy enough to create the first fundamental particles. Then these fundamental particles gravitated into distinct clumps of nebulae, which were proto-galaxies that created the first stars, which created the more secondary particles of denser atoms. Upon dying, these stars created supernovae, dispersing hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, carbon, and other elements out into random directions of the universe. These elements coalesced into the rocks that made up Earth over 4.5 billion years ago. It almost took a billion years for Earth to cool enough to make liquid water and for the ideal conditions to make the first simple organic compounds emerge via abiogenesis. Because Earth is within a closed system of consistent external energy from the sun, it allowed entropy to be less pronounced here than in the rest of the universe to create biological order. The simple organic compounds evolved into multicellular organisms about 2 billion years ago, who evolved into more complex invertebrates, who figured out sexual reproduction a billion years ago, who evolved into our common ancestor with fish, who evolved into our common ancestor with amphibians, who evolved into our common ancestor with reptiles, who themselves later split from a common ancestor into birds. We humans arose from a common ancestor of marsupials about 200 million years ago, followed by a common ancestor with all placentals. Tens of millions of years ago, our family of the great apes began to evolve. We had a common ancestor with gorillas about 9 million years ago, and a common ancestor with chimpanzees and bonobos shortly after that, on evolutionary timescales. The earliest bipedal ape emerged 4 million years ago, and the first specialized tools were used 3.5 million years ago. Curiosity drove Homo habilis out of Africa 2 million years ago, and Homo erectus, the stereotypical caveman, began using fire shortly thereafter. Neanderthals then came on the scene hundreds of thousands of years ago, then split and co-bred along Homo sapiens until the purebred Neanderthals went extinct around 38,000 BC. Then the evolution of human thought and consciousness began to take place to explain the origin and truth of Homo sapiens. The oldest known written language was about 5,500 years ago, which is only between 200 and 300 generations of Homo sapien evolution, which allowed mythologies to go fairly unchanged for multiple generations. These mythologies birthed other mythologies, which were relayed with an air of historicity to validate the whimsical claims told alongside the mythologies. The gullible believed the mythologies as historical facts to the point that they believed that the earth was a fairly new creation, alongside the newly enlightened man, who had a level of consciousness capable of subduing nature to his own will, to an extent. Many claimed to speak on behalf of their creators or creator, contaminating the perfection of Zilch with bouts of somethingness to be feared and worshipped. But knowledge progressed, science evolved, and precision of thought increased among the intellectuals of the population, which accelerated in the era called the Age of Enlightenment, which began around 1685 AD. The hierarchy of sciences were thoroughly searched out. Darwinian evolution was introduced for biology, followed by the periodic table of elements for chemistry 10 years later. Then the standard model of particles for physics 100 years after that. And now, in the early internet age, with a generation of humans having full access to the knowledge found by generations past, seek a scientifically based, mathematical, and logically sound theory of everything, when they should be looking for a theory of nothing instead. The theory of nothing! Welcome to the next evolution of thought and consciousness, the theory of nothing, where we are not even wrong, not because we are pseudoscientific, but precisely because we will allow science to prove us wrong. That way, we will always be correct, which is not even wrong. The null hypothesis will always be there to contend against the ludicrous hypotheses that are believed by anybody. Presuppose nothing, and you will be presupposing no thing. And as for the less than ludicrous hypotheses, we will change our minds when sufficient evidence is brought forth, as we all should. Evolution is a constant rolling of the dice on life to see what will and will not work. For instance, the invention of the car gave us a time when the more conscientious driver was selected more often than not. The invention of vaccines also gave the conscientious individual an advantage over the diseases they protect us against, more so than the individuals who are against them. So long as the multiverse has some probability of a certain outcome, the possibility of evolution selecting for that path will remain open. A random cosmic ray turning on a gene here, a beneficial mutation there, the changes are so insignificant that we only notice them whenever they become a problem. So what evidence is there for evolution by natural selection? Let's see. There's the E. coli long-term evolution experiment that has observed tens of thousands of generations of E. coli adapting to various conditions. There are also several fruit fly experiments conducted, including one that created a fly specifically adapted to low oxygen environments. Not to mention the Darwinian finches that evolved into 15 different species on the Galapagos Islands. Even the distinction between Chihuahua dogs and St. Bernard dogs is an example of evolution, even though it is human-guided in all of these instances. But if humans by themselves can create such drastic changes via eugenics and selective breeding in a short amount of time, the change in environment and climate over longer periods should happen naturally. Even evolution is thus consistent with the null hypothesis because it is true. The simplest solution to explain our current existence is that the universe we see is billions of years old. And with those billions of years, the observations point to the fact that the mathematical and philosophical equivalent to nothing gave rise to physical dimensions at the Big Bang, which gave rise to fundamental particles, which gave rise to chemical elements, which gave rise to biological life, which gave biological life the inevitability to emerge naturally on a planet with the right chemical makeup and external energy input. Evolution is not very intuitive. It was and is a hard-fought hypothesis that is still working its way through the minds of the population. We only ever see the world as it is right now. We weren't there 1,000 years ago. We weren't there 1 billion years ago. But we can look up into space and see the electromagnetic footprint of times past and dig up the massive evidence from times past to reach the truth of the current state of our own existence. And the evidence is clear for those who look without a lens of confirmation bias. Darwinian evolution by natural selection is a reliable branch of knowledge to believe in, so a null dimensionalist can believe in the general concept of biological evolution with a 99.99% degree of confidence. Chapter 3. Mass Electric Spacetime. There are many words that one can use to say that they hold themselves to the nonsense held within this gospel. They may call themselves adherers to the null hypothesis, even though it is a bit long-winded. They may call themselves Ziltrialites, similarly sounding to the word Israelite, while simultaneously claiming the truth that Zilch is real. You can go your own way, O culture, to name thyselves however you please. But as for myself, the self-proclaimed non-prophet, I am a biagnostic nihilist and a dimensionalist. Why? Because I discovered the primary dimensions before I discovered Zilchanata, and the zeroth dimension is arguably the most important dimension for a dimensionalist to make sense of things. Aristotle's indivisible entity. While I was writing the first rendition of this book, which I named The Normie's Guide to the Theory of Nothing, I completed the reading of Aristotle's The Metaphysics just to get the great philosopher's relatively unique take on the subject, as to make sure I didn't miss anything fundamentally important in my own ponderings. Some of it was archaic from my perspective, but considering the level of quality of knowledge available to him at the time, I found myself impressed. It was like he was just a few revelations short of becoming a nihilist, since there were many instances where he wrote exactly what I would have written, but only comprehended one of the meanings. Anyways, Aristotle spent a majority of his metaphysical writings trying to logically work his way back to find the first principles that make up everything, and that one nature of this first principle is that it is an indivisible entity. So me being me, I recognized almost immediately that the zeroth dimension is in itself the indivisible entity that he sought. As far as points are concerned, there is precisely one, and yet it is also nothing, for its dimensionality is zero. Building up from a singular point of nothingness, it requires at least 2 points to make a 1D line, 3 at minimum to make a 2D plane, and 4 points to make 3D space. Only 1 point by itself gives us nothing, which may as well be 0 points since it is indistinguishable from a singular point in 0D space. To even try to pick out a single point and to contrast it with 0 points is absurd, and yet this first principle is all we are left with. Nothing at all. The primary dimensions. Beyond the 0th dimension, all objective qualities of anything can be derived from 4 primary physical dimensions. MELT. Where is the mass, the electromagnetism, the length, and the time? These 4 dimension types, along with their respective emergent secondary dimensions, can tell you any objective fact about anything within the existing universe. And for all other subjective facts, we use math, quantitative measurements, and language, qualitative measurements, to explain these things. I never really get into why math is a subjective dimension in this book, but I have other places where I go into it in greater detail. Yeah. You can easily recall all 6 dimension types by picturing a Dairy Queen blizzard quickly melting in the sun. DQ quickly melt. The dimensions are quantitative and qualitative. These are subjective and set apart from the objective mass, electromagnetism, length, and time. With these 6 dimensions, we can measure everything. And by proxy, for anything that is claimed to exist, a dimensionalist should provide a measuring test that is falsifiable, replicatable, and free of simpler causal explanations. If such a test is not provided alongside a claim, usually the claim should be dismissed. Claims that are asserted without evidence can be dismissed without evidence. And when the evidence is questionable, question it profusely. So now the question remains, how many of each dimension are there? 6 is the bare minimum we need to adequately explain everything that is objective. Adding a mass and an electric dimension to Minkowski and Einstein's 4D spacetime, a mass-electric spacetime. Can I just stop here for a second and brag about how metal that name for our observable universe sounds? Oh yeah, I was just taking a leisurely stroll on a remote inhabited planet of mass-electric spacetime, guitar riffs, when suddenly a tiger emerged from an earthquake-induced crack in the ground. The tiger looked at me in the eye and said, "Come, O conscious creature of mass-electric spacetime, jump on my back with that guitar of yours and let's fly to a distant, unexplored moon." Metal! Gosh, that yelling. Anyways, back to the counting beyond 6 dimensions. It can be further deduced that both the electric and the time dimensions have at least one additional dimension. For electric currents, electromagnetic waves travel at 90 degrees alongside each other. We cannot explain both the magnetic field and the electric field with a single dimension. We need 2 to encompass both of these phenomena. The second time dimension is observed thusly. If we cannot perfectly predict quantum events, and there is simply a probability distribution, then causality over time cannot be fixed in a single dimension and would require an additional degree of freedom to account for this uncertainty. Time as we perceive it is then describable as a continuously observed collapse of a probability wave function, rather than a determinate timeline. Quantum or macro event X would always lead to quantum or macro event Y in a single dimension of causality, and this does not appear to be the case. Listen here. Duration and causality represent 2 different iterations of physical time dimensions. If an entity of matter X begins to exist right now, the path towards the entity's non-existent state Y is not set in stone from our perspective. It could end up burning in a volcano. It could end up blown up by a bomb. It could last for millions of years preserved in the dirt until it naturally decomposes. Or it could split into 2 unentity pieces by a samurai sword. It could last for billions of years in the vacuum of space away from all other sources of mass until a stray gamma ray obliterates it. It could meet its end in a star or a black hole. All of these scenarios for this entity X will most likely be actualized in some universe within the multiverse of non-verses. But they will all have some indication of duration from which observers of the same universe would be able to determine by guesstimation or knowledge how long entity X has existed. All of these durations combined make up the causality field, and it requires two time-like dimensions. This is the multiverse. So in total, there is only one mass dimension, which we call the Higgs field. There are two electromagnetic dimensions, which make up the electromagnetic field. There are three length dimensions, which consist of height, width, and depth in space. And there appears to be only two time dimensions, which I, Tim, have again named the causality field. This implies that we live in an 8-dimensional physical plane of existence. Even though we can only observe 7 physical dimensions in our day-to-day universe, the whole of the physical multiverse is 8-dimensional, assuming electromagnetism and causality is incapable of being reduced to one physical dimension. Then beyond the physical plane, all mathematical dimensions are included in one necessary type of dimension to supplement physical reality. We could say there is the real and the imaginary, 2 math dimensions, but they both work under similar imagined premises. Then all other language-derived qualia dimensions are added as one necessary type of dimension to supplement physical reality. All adjective-based qualitative descriptors likewise work under the same ideal premises of languages that is irreducible to ones and zeros. We could try, but there is almost always some nuance that is lost. To describe the universe, we have to use our mouth words. D0, M1, D0, Q1, Q1, M1, E2, L3, T2. 10 dimensions. It's clear whenever you read it. That's all for this episode.